But The Man Who Has Everything is a comic book published in 1985 by DC Comics. It was created by the writer Alan Moore and the artist Dave Gibbons, who was the creative team behind the better-known graphic novel Watchmen. The premise of the story is that it's Superman's birthday, and Batman, Wonder Woman, and Robin go to visit him, and they find that he's been attacked by the villain Mongol, who's the big, scary yellow guy up there. Mongol has trapped Superman in a parasitic plant called the Black Mercy that feeds him a simulation of his heart's deepest desire. And what we learn from this is that Superman's deepest desire is to have lived on his home planet Krypton, which exploded when he was a baby. And so in this simulation, he's lived an entire lifetime there and raised a family there. And this introduces the implication that for a hero, the ideal world is a world in which they don't actually have to be a hero, which was a fairly revolutionary idea at the time in comic books. This is the basic representation of the two extremes that superhero comics can fall under. I've used movies just because that's an easier point of reference for most people. On the one hand, you've got the 1960s Batman starring Adam West. It's colorful, vibrant, not meant to be taken seriously. It's very silly, and to a large extent, at the time, it was directed at children. On the other hand, you have The Dark Knight, which is darker, obviously. It's more violent, and thematically and psychologically, it's a lot more complex. Generally, it's directed at an older audience. Comic book historians would call the first one an example of Silver Age
The
story.
reason Superman was given so many powers is so that you can understand that the physical manifestations of enemies were never really the threat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's always capable of overpowering them, and so you're never supposed to question whether or not he's going to win, because he's always going to lose against humans. So where does that change?
Right, well, the Golden Age was when all those stories were published, and that addressed a lot of those issues. Over the years, comic books became a lot more lighthearted because of the CCA, and so throughout the Silver Age, you don't really have any sort of address of that. And then more often, starting in the Bronze Age, but especially in the modern age, there's been more relevance towards social issues, comparing Superman to immigrants, for instance, showing kind of the divide between he has this original home place that's a part of his identity, but the place that he lives is another part of his identity. So that originally was part of the comics and then kind of disappeared and then made a comeback in more recent years.
Okay, so Jerry Siegel had it, and it was taken away in whatever age. Do you know who writes it now? That includes all the...
Well, there's a lot of different writers.
Okay.
Usually a writer will maybe work on a comic for a couple years and then someone else will take over. Alan Moore, who wrote the story, is one of the big people that led the change. More recently, Mark Waid is a writer who's incorporated a lot of that. I haven't read it. There's a series recently written by Max Landis called Superman American Alien. That's about a lot of that stuff. So I should probably give that a read at some point.
Is that where humans have to adapt to alien culture? Or the incorporation of aliens into Earth?
Yeah, there's also, it brings up, there's a story called New Krypton a while ago, where it was revealed that all these other aliens had survived the destruction of his world and ended up coming to Earth. And that was a big reversal, kind of along the lines that you're talking about.
Okay.
So, see, on your sources, you've got the Supergirl episode where they deal with the Black Mercy. In that episode, they dealt with it in a very different way, where it wasn't given to a villain or anything like that. It was more of like a torture thing. She was in it, in that fantasy, and it was really scary for her. Like, she was aware that it wasn't what was really happening. So, in a way, is that kind of like, what does that say about Superman, that he was willing to just escape into that, whereas someone like Supergirl was fighting against it?
Yeah, in my paper I had a whole section on how the same story has been adapted into other media. And essentially it's the same plot device, but a completely different tone, completely different storyline to it. I think a lot of that has to do with the idea that she originally came from Krypton, grew up there, and then left, whereas Superman has no actual direct memory of it because he was an infant. So it's a very different experience for the two of them.
I guess that's going to be a double question. One, I want to know your personal opinion on, did you believe that these comics were starting child violence and all that stuff compared to like modern day with the more recent stuff because it's darker and more intense versus like, I mean, I guess they make video games out of these also, like in the video game spectrum also, not saying that this is for a video game, this is their comics, but I'm saying they have made video games out of this, and since they are darker and they're more of that stuff, would you say that it's inspiring more breakouts of kids being destructive?
Right. Yeah, the whole idea that comic books were causing juvenile delinquency was a writer named Frederick Wortham, who was a child psychologist, and he observed that most of the juvenile delinquents that he worked with read comic books. What he didn't realize is that in general, most children at that time read comic books, so he made kind of a false causation there. So generally his work isn't regarded very seriously today. Even at the time, the comic books, by today's standards, are actually pretty tame. So I don't think there's much of a chance that there is much basis to that. Mm-hmm.
I just want to kind of clarify your views on The Man Who Has Everything. So could you kind of distinguish your interpretation of the story or narrative to what other people are saying about it?
I guess I approached it just as a fan initially. So a lot of this stuff was more doing research for a lot of the social stuff, for instance. I didn't initially pick up on the way that it was kind of rewriting a lot of the Silver Age and taking some of the social elements from like 1970s comics. That's as I, especially in Dr. Wonke's comic book class, studied the history of comic books, and then reading this story picked up on a lot of things that I wouldn't have otherwise.
So is that your idea, or is that how people discuss The Man Who Has Everything as that transitional tale?
I guess that's more my idea based on the research that I've read of those periods of history.
Okay, but nobody else has said that about The Man Who Has Everything?
Not from the research that I was looking at.
Okay, good. So I just have to clarify that part, right? So what do they say about it then?
A lot of it was basically just, most of my research was just picking up basic facts about it and then kind of drawing my own conclusions based on that. Basically just looking at the comic book code, the different ages of history. So I didn't go into a whole lot of how other people have analyzed it. I did do some research on the creators and the different feelings that they have around it. Didn't go into a whole lot of scholarly writings about it, though.
Thank you, Josh.
Mm-hmm.